grateful you step up the plate in your capacity. And I am particularly grateful to the men and women of DHS, of the Border Patrol that have kind of rallied to try and deal with this overwhelming situation. You know, there may be some instances, there may be a few bad apples, but the men and women that I talk to, that I see dealing with this humanitarian crisis on the border are doing everything they can to treat these individuals with care and compassion. But they're overwhelmed by the situation. So again, I just want everybody to keep in mind what the reality situation is. Ask yourself, how would you handle it? How would you manage this? And what I would suggest is the solution, which we've been suggesting all along, is, in this case, with this problem in the here and now, is let's address the root cause, this uncontrolled flow of individuals. And I would argue that the goal of our policy, the first goal, and we have so many different problems associated with this illegal flow, but the first goal of our policy should be to reduce that flow, which is what the letter we sent to DHS, working with them to design a pilot program called Operation Safe Return, whose goal would be to rapidly and more accurately determine those individuals that clearly don't have a legal claim to stay in this country and safely return them to their home country, to the safe regions of Central America. And there are safe regions of Central America. That's important to point out. So again, the focus on this committee hearing is what can we do with this overwhelming situation to improve the conditions. We all want to do that. I'm not particularly interested in placing blame. I'm interested in what can we do to address this overwhelming and out-of-control situation. I'd ask that my written statement be entered in the record. With that, I'll turn it over to Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the end of May, Chairman Johnson, Senator Hassan, and I were together visiting the U.S.-Mexican border. And on that trip, we saw firsthand the tremendous challenges that the Department of Homeland Security personnel and local communities are facing at the southern border. It's clear that our infrastructure and our personnel are overwhelmed. Resources are stretched thin and are being shifted away from other priorities like the northern border. And our capacity to address the humanitarian needs of children and families is overburdened. Despite those difficulties, we witnessed hardworking law enforcement officers, public servants, volunteers, and civic leaders all doing their very best to manage a very difficult situation. At the same time, it is impossible to ignore the reports and the images that have emerged regarding substandard conditions and unacceptable treatment and tragic deaths of children at some customs and border protection locations. And I'm also alarmed at the reports that we have seen regarding unprofessional and unacceptable conduct from a small number of Border Patrol agents. The situation at our southern border is, of course, incredibly challenging. It is clear that our current system is not equipped to process and care for the unprecedented number of families and children seeking asylum at the southern border. Some of the images that we have seen and the stories we have heard, I believe, do not reflect the overall efforts of the Customs and Border Protection folks, the hardworking men and women who secure our borders, and they certainly do not reflect the values of this great nation. But it is clear that there are significant challenges on the ground, and to some extent, problems within the agency's culture that must be swiftly and adequately addressed. In recent weeks, we have seen a decline in the number of migrants arriving along the southern border. The pressure appears to be decreasing, at least temporarily. This drop has helped ease overcrowding at many border facilities. Billions of dollars in supplemental funding has enabled DHS to improve their response to these challenges. And today, I hope this committee will hear specifics on how those additional taxpayer dollars are being used. However, as members of this committee know, much of the migration that occurs from Mexico and the Northern Triangle countries is seasonal. This fall, we can expect to see the number of arrivals rise again. We now have an opportunity to examine where we have failed and where we have succeeded and put lessons into practice. We need innovative ideas to improve migrant processing, to relieve the strain on our frontline border security professionals and other agencies that have provided support services in recent months, and to keep our borders secure and our country safe. Few issues we face are as complex as this one, but today I hope we can find common ground identify bipartisan solutions, and deliver real comprehensive results for the American people. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to your testimony and responding to our questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Peters. It is the tradition of this committee to swear in witnesses, so if you both stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Our first witness is Acting Commissioner Mark Morgan. Commissioner Morgan began serving his country as a U.S. Marine and his community in local law enforcement. After completing a 20-year career in the FBI, he began service in the Department of Homeland Security as the Acting Assistant Commissioner for Internal Affairs before being appointed by President Obama as Chief of the U.S. Border Patrol. He served as Chief until January 2017. He returned to DHS as the Acting Director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement in May of this year and began his current role as Acting Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection on July 7th. Commissioner Morgan.
Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Peters, and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to appear before you today. I'd like to begin with a story. On May 30th, Border Patrol agents from the Del Rio sector saw a group of undocumented migrants crossing the Rio Grande in Texas. The agents watched as smugglers carried a paraplegic man to the river, then callously threw him in. The paraplegic man, of course, immediately began to drown. Fighting the strong river current, agents were able to reach the drowning victim and safely bring him to shore. Had agents not been there, he would have added to the 172 deaths discovered along the southwest border in desolate locations and rivers, resulting from the dangerous trek and complete disregard for human life at the hands of smugglers. This is one of more than 4,000 rescues performed by CBP this year, with Border Patrol leading the way. This is who the men and women of the United States Customs and Border Protection are. They risk their lives every single day to help and protect whomever is in distress. They don't ask what the person's nationality is or whether they're trying to illegally enter this country. They simply see a human being needing help, and that's exactly what they provide them. The men and women of CBP are not running concentration camps, making those in our custody drink from toilets, nor denying them access to toothbrushes. That is simply not true. This is the kind of irresponsible rhetoric that they have to endure from both the media and even some of our own congressional leaders. It's unjust and does nothing to bring us closer to resolving one of the most divisive issues that we face in our country. Stories of agents saving lives from the drowning Rio Grande, dying of dehydration in the desert, and suffering in stash houses or at the hands of smugglers, that goes unreported. The demonizing of law enforcement professionals must stop. These false, misinformed, and overheated attacks are demoralizing and serves to further deteriorate the public's understanding and perception of what the true issues are and what needs to be done to end this crisis. We should be coming together to focus our efforts on the real enemy, the cartels and smugglers who make billions of dollars at the expense of an extremely vulnerable population while exploiting the loopholes in our immigration legal framework to facilitate their operation. Over the past year, Homeland Security leadership has repeatedly told Congress and the press that we have an emergency on our hands. We have provided statistics about the alarming and unprecedented increase in apprehension. That number is over 800,000 year to date. We have explained how the demographics of this mass migration are unlike previous arrivals and how families and children from Central America present significantly different challenges with regard to their care and processing. Over 450,000 of these apprehensions were family units and over 80,000 were unaccompanied children. Combined, that's over 300,000 children have entered our custody since October 1st of last year. These numbers are staggering, unprecedented, and have overwhelmed every aspect of our border and immigration enforcement system. Last week, I met with the ministers of security from the Northern Triangle countries, who all of them expressed their collective frustration that, quote, the future of their countries are leaving for America, and, quote, they want their children back. We at CBP DHS. We are comforting infants. We're taking the sick to the hospital, averaging over 800 hospital visits per day. We are expanding our medical care, ensuring children are provided medical screenings. We're building soft-sided facilities to provide a more adequate environment for families and children, costing tens of millions of dollars per month to operate. We are providing food, clothing, and other basic necessities. We have pulled agents from the border security mission to help process the massive volume of migrants. In some sectors, up to 50% of agents are pulled off the line to support the extraordinary humanitarian effort along our southwest border. We have pulled agents from our northern and coastal duty stations. We have pulled more than 700 officers away from ports. We have called for volunteers from all across the government to help us manage the surge of humanity. The recent supplemental, it helped. But as we've been saying, this is merely treating the symptoms of this crisis. It does not cure the cause. Looks like I'm about running out of time. If I could have just a few more seconds.
Take the time, finish your statement.
Smugglers openly advertise a safe and legal journey to the United States. They tell migrants and their families that there is a policy in the United States that anyone who arrives with a child will not be deported. We have stats and facts to show that's exactly what's being communicated, and our laws support that perception. If there is not a specific and meaningful changes in our laws, our detention facilities will continue to be overwhelmed, our personnel will continue to be diverted from their primary missions to safeguard this country. Legitimate trade and travel will continue to suffer. Our ability to prevent dangerous narcotics and criminals illegally entering our country will continue to be greatly diminished. And smugglers, like the ones who threw the paraplegic man in the Rio Grande, they will continue to profit. Although we are seeing the numbers across all demographics decreasing at the moment, due in large part to the efforts of this current administration, working with the government of Mexico as well as our Northern Triangle countries to address this as a true regional crisis and concern, this is not a durable long-term solution concerning the national security and humanitarian crisis we are facing. Congress must acknowledge this is a crisis and pass meaningful legislation to address the loopholes in our current legal framework. Thank you for your time. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. Our next witness is Ms. Jennifer Costello. Ms. Costello is now the Deputy Inspector General for the Department of Homeland Security. Prior to Thursday, when we actually did get confirmed Inspector General Kufari, she was the Acting Inspector General, and we appreciate your service from that standpoint. Ms. Costello has been the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General since 2017, and prior to her experiences at DHS, she spent over 13 years as an Assistant Director in the Forensic Audits and Special Investigations Unit at the Government Accountability Office. And again, I appreciate you spending some time in my office. So we talked a little bit about how GAO can help get the metrics on Operation Safe Return. So again, Ms. Costello, welcome.
Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Peters, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me here today to discuss DHS OIG's recent work on conditions at Customs and Border Protection holding facilities at the southern border. My testimony today will focus on our two recent management alerts regarding the dangerous overcrowding and prolonged detention observed by DHS OIG inspectors at the El Paso del Norte Processing Center in May of this year, and facilities in the Rio Grande Valley in June. We issued these alerts because the conditions we observed posed a serious and imminent threat to both the health and safety of DHS personnel and detainees. DHS OIG conducts unannounced inspections of CBP facilities to evaluate compliance with CBP's Transport, Escort, Detention, and Search Standards, otherwise known as the TEDS standards. TEDS standards govern CBP's interactions with detainees, providing guidance on things like duration of detention, access to medical care, access to food and water, and hygiene. Our unannounced inspections enable us to identify instances of noncompliance with TED standards and to propose appropriate corrective action to the department. In doing so, we seek to drive transparency and accountability at the Department of Homeland Security. Although CBP has struggled at times to achieve full compliance with detention standards, our recent unannounced inspections revealed a situation far more grievous than those previously encountered by our inspectors. For instance, when our team arrived at the El Paso del Norte Processing Center, they found that the facility, which has a maximum capacity of 125 detainees, had more than 750 detainees on site. The following day, that number increased to 900. Additionally, at all the Border Patrol facilities we visited in the Rio Grande Valley, we observed serious overcrowding among unaccompanied alien children, or UACs. We also found that individuals, including children, were being detained well beyond the 72 hours generally permitted under TED standards and the Flores Agreement. For instance, at the Centralized Processing Center in McAllen, Texas, many children had been in custody longer than a week, and some UACs under the age of 7 had been in custody for more than 2 weeks. Under these circumstances, CBP has struggled to comply with TED standards. For instance, although all facilities we visited in the Rio Grande Valley had infant formula, diapers, baby wipes, and juice and snacks for children, 2 facilities had not provided children access to hot meals as required until the week we arrived. Additionally, children at 3 of the 5 facilities we visited had no access to showers, limited access to a change of clothes, and no access to laundry facilities. Space limitations also affect single adults. The lack of space has restricted CBP's ability to separate detainees with infectious diseases, such as chickenpox, scabies, and influenza, from each other and from the general population. According to CBP management, these conditions also affect the health of Border Patrol agents who are experiencing high incidence of illness. Further, there is a concern that the overcrowding and prolonged detention may be contributing to rising tensions among detainees. A senior manager at one facility in the Rio Grande Valley called the situation, quote, a ticking time bomb. Despite these immense challenges, we observed CBP staff interacting with the detainees in a professional and respectful manner and attempting to comply with standards to the extent possible. Notwithstanding these efforts, Border Patrol requires immediate assistance to manage the overcrowding in its facilities. CBP is not responsible for providing long-term detention, and CBP facilities like those we visited are not designed to hold individuals for lengthy periods of time. However, with limited bed space available in ICE facilities and HHS facilities nationwide, detainees are left in CBP custody until a placement can be found. In its response to our recent management alerts, DHS described the situation on the southern border as an acute and worsening crisis. Our observations comport with that characterization, which is why we have called on the department to take immediate action to begin to remedy the situation. DHS OIG will continue to monitor and report on the situation at the border. In the meantime, the department's leadership must develop a strategic, coordinated approach that will allow it to make good on its commitment to ensure the safety, security, and care of those in its custody. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. I'm happy to answer any questions the committee has.
Thank you, Ms. Costello. I want to, throw a couple of numbers on some of these issues that have been raised. We talked a little bit about the capacity of the border stations. First of all, generally, except for the McAllen, Texas facilities and some of the temporary facilities, these Border Patrol stations are basically police stations, correct? They're not designed whatsoever to really house any volume of people.
No, not at all, and that, I think, is the problem, what we're seeing in the overcrowding. They're simply not designed to house the capacity of migrants that they're getting at this time.
Commissioner Morgan, I think we got information from you. The basic capacity of the hard-sided facilities is about 4,000?
Yes, sir, that's correct. And during this time period that the reviews were being done by the OIG, which we appreciate, welcome, and enjoy the partnership. At that time, we reached the highest apprehensions in the month of May, over 140,000. At that time, our detention capacity of those we had in custody reached 19,000, and our capacity was 4,000.
I got 19,699 on June 3rd. And even that 4,000 capacity, is that fire code capacity, or is that just how many we can generally chalk in one facility?
That's all across the southwest border, including the sectors and approximately 70 stations. That's what we refer to as 4,000 to 4,500. We refer to that as a manageable population.
Senator Peters made the comment and asked the question about how has the dollars been spent. It was unfortunate it took 2 months for that emergency funding request to be passed. But my information I've received, I think, from you and others is that prior to the funding, we had about 2,700 unaccompanied children in custody, Border Patrol, beyond 72 hours, up to as many as 10 days, a few outliers beyond that. But within a couple of weeks, we were down to a little bit more than a day's intake, about 300, with an average stay of about 30 hours. Is that pretty accurate in terms of what,
Yes,
what the
sir.
conditions were and what they are currently?
Yes, sir. Again, during the time of the OIG review, we were topped out about 2,700 unaccompanied minors, and today we're averaging the past week between 250 to 300, with less than 20 over 72 hours, and several of those are due to medical conditions.
And the reason you were backlogged so much is there simply wasn't the bed space or detention facilities open in HHS until they had the funding for them,
Yes, sir,
correct?
that's correct. And I think she represented it well, is that we have interdependencies. When it comes to UACs, we're relying on HSS OOR to take those children. And then for single adults and families, we rely on ICE to remove those from our custody.
So Border Patrol had really no option other than to continue to hold those children until bed space opened up in HHS. You couldn't just let them into the communities. I mean, it was you were responsible for them, and you had to keep them in your custody in obviously crowded conditions because you got 4,000 and, capacity of 4,000, and you had more than 19,000 people in custody.
Yes, sir, that's correct. And both El Paso and RGV at the time, and still RGV to this day, they were two of the sectors that were getting inundated the most. El Paso, I'm sure we've already heard, one day, one single large group of over 1,000, of which 90% of them were families and kids, hit the El Paso sector in a single day.
Ms. Costello, I appreciate the fact that you made the comment that the Border Patrol personnel that your inspectors talked to were professional, they were respectful. They were doing everything they could do to take care of these children and family members in their custody, that they've been basically given the responsibility to take care of. Is that accurate?
That's a fair assessment, Senator, and those are our experiences. Obviously, OIG would never discount anybody else's experience, but our inspectors have been doing this for a while and have always encountered very professional CBP staff.
I mean, it's certainly been my experience when I've encountered them at the border, as I've talked to Border Patrol personnel. I mean, they're trying to cope with the situation with as much humanity and compassion as they possibly can muster. So, again, there may be a few outliers, there may be a few instances. We saw the texts or the whatever. Those are obviously unacceptable, regrettable. But the vast majority of the men and women of DHS and Border Patrol are trying to cope with this. I am concerned, in your testimony, you're talking about Border Patrol agents becoming ill, the illnesses coming across the border. We have a pretty long list of them. I'm concerned about drug-resistant strains of tuberculosis, those types of things. I'm concerned about Border Patrol attrition. Is that something that you're really taking a look at in your inspections? Basically the basic morale of Border Patrol personnel trying to cope with this.
No, morale in and of itself is not a specific focus of our work, but we are looking into the drivers behind that prolonged detention to see, as Mr. Morgan was suggesting, what's going on with ICE and HHS that's leading to some of these problems.
The Commissioner talked about the larger aspect, a dimension that I don't think's reported on enough about, is the whole human trafficking element. We had HSI witness here talking about a child sold for $84. When we were down at the border, a 3-year-old boy left in a field, his name and a phone number written on his shoe. The fact that we are finding these families in stash houses, they're being beaten, the beatings being videotaped, being sent back to Central America demanding ransom. The involuntary servitude. Senator Portman had an investigation a couple of years ago on unaccompanied children showing up in an involuntary servitude situation in an egg farm. Are you looking at that aspect in the Inspector General's office?
No, not at this time, and we'd have to be careful about jurisdictional issues related to some of that. Having said that, we're very open to considering all sorts of issues on the table, but what we actually have authority and purview over is one of the first questions we ask.
Commissioner Morgan, let me throw it to you in terms of your concern over just basic attrition. I don't think anybody would want to spend the night in those facilities. And I am highly concerned. Again, I went down there and you could see the holding cells for scabies and for chicken pox and for flu. I would be concerned about Border Patrol personnel kind of giving up and trying to take a position elsewhere, either in the federal government or in the private sector. Can you just kind of talk to your general assessment? You've been on the job now for a few weeks of
Yes,
been
sir.
with the Border Patrol?
Yes, sir, and I harken back to my time as chief of the Border Patrol in 2016, and I think the IG's report captures it well. You know, the Border Patrol, CBP personnel, all those entities are helping us. Their mothers, fathers, brothers, and sisters. What the overcrowding that you see, we have all said that we have to do better, that children and families should not be held in police stations for a long-term period of time. We all agree with that. So absolutely, it affects them every single day. I worry about their health and their morale, and I think absolutely it's being impacted. Along with the frustrations, they also know Congress could do some things if they could work together to pass meaningful legislation. That's equally as frustrating for them as well. Right now, though, the hiring numbers for us are okay. They're not going in a downward departure, but I'm concerned about the future.
Well, that's good to hear. I've run out of time. I do want to talk about the solution in terms of reducing that flow, but we'll save that for later on. Senator Peters.
Mr. Chairman, my office has received a statement from Church World Services, and I'd like to ask unanimous consent that be entered into the hearing record.
Objection?
Thank you. Mr. Morgan, it's clear that we are confronted with a significant problem on the southern border, and the challenges are wide-ranging and require, I think, significant coordination from a number of federal agencies coming together, and that means also federal, state, and local. Truly a whole-of-government approach is necessary to confront this. So could you describe how CBP is coordinating with other DHS components, including USCIS, ICE, and CBP, as well as HHS and ORR?
Yes, sir. So the coordination specifically with USCIS and ICE, that's really done on a daily basis. For example, we talked about the interdependencies that we have specifically with respect to ICE. One of the largest challenges we have right now are single adults. Again, ICE does not have adequate bed space, and so it's a constant struggle with the number of apprehensions we have to be able to ensure and get them out of our custody as fast as possible to ICE. So we're coordinating with ICE on a daily basis with respect to how we can expeditiously get those single adults out of our custody into ICE. USCIS, obviously, we work with them on a daily basis. They are the asylum officers. They are the ones that actually determine and adjudicate someone's credible fear claim as they go through the process. They're in our stations. We're working with them constantly. DHS, again, this is not just a CBP issue. This is not just an ICE issue. It really is a DHS issue. It's even outside of DHS. Right now, we have hundreds of volunteers from across DHS that have been deployed to the southwest border to help us specifically with the humanitarian crisis.
So you talk about daily coordination, but is there an interagency group in a formalized way that is actually coordinating this on a regular basis, or is this ad hoc as you're just talking to other agencies?
No, it's both. So we both have working groups at the local level, each field. So each field has their own entity that they work, whether it's El Paso, RGV, with those entities. And then at DHS, there's also a working group that's led by DHS that has a lot of different subgroups and subcommittees. But we're doing it on a formal basis.
Because that's important. I mean, when we're trying to think about how we coordinate all these activities, which is going to require, I'm always frustrated as to knowing who's actually in charge, who's actually responsible for making sure all of these pieces are working together, and I never seem to get a real good answer about that. That has me concerned. And I guess, you know, that leads to the question, is anyone at the White House facilitating the coordination of these activities?
They're absolutely involved in every aspect of this
Who's doing that at
crisis.
the White House?
Different entities. It depends on what lane it is.
So different entities are coordinating. Is there one entity that's really responsible for coordinating all this?
Well, I would say it depends, sir, on what element you're talking about with respect to the certain conditions you're talking about. I mean, we could talk about media. That could be held by a different individual. If you're talking about what we can do within the current legal framework to stem the flow of migration, then we would be talking to different people within the White House.
Is there someone who's in charge of coordinating state and local governments as well as NGOs, which are critical component of all this?
Yes, sir. DHS has a state and local partner coordinator. Yes, sir.
It's that person's in charge that we could ask, how is that coordination going?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Morgan, the FY19 appropriations bill has included $128 million for CBP to contract with medical professionals. And a recent emergency supplemental included roughly $112 million for medical care and consumables. Given the number of children who are arriving at our southern border, how much of the FY19 and supplemental funding has been spent on pediatric medical professionals?
So on specific pediatric care, I don't have those numbers in front of me, but we are looking at $63 million for continued and additional medical assets and high-risk support across the southwest border. That was contained in the supplemental moving forward.
But we want to know how it's being spent, how many folks are involved. I mean, part of our oversight function here is to understand exactly how that money is being spent. It's the intent of Congress to make sure we're providing medical services to those folks who need it. And we are accountable to the taxpayers for that money and how it's spent. So I'd certainly like to do a deeper dive with you to have a better sense of that.
And I have that data. I'll be able to provide that, sir.
And where these professionals are being sent, any shortfalls, challenges, all of that is going to be important for us to do our work.
We have all that data, sir.
Thank you. So while the recent management alert is certainly the main discussion point for us today, it is my understanding that this alert, Ms. Costello, is part of a much larger oversight effort that's related to the CBP and ICE detention facilities. I think it's important for this committee to hear you describe what other reviews are currently in progress, and more importantly, when do you expect those reports to actually be released?
Senator, we have a lot in this space. Following on the management alerts, I think in my written testimony, you may have seen this is part of a larger series of unannounced inspections that we did all along the southern border. So these two alerts were issued because of the serious nature of what we found, but we will be issuing a capping report this fall to identify the findings in all the facilities. We're also looking at, since you were asking Mr. Morgan about it, how we're going to audit how that aid is being spent. Not all of it, but the consumables, the medical access, things of that nature. We are looking at asylum seekers at the southern border, separating families at ports of entry, whether or not families were given the opportunity to be removed with their children, things of that nature. We're looking at the underlying causes of the prolonged detention. So why 72? Why are we going beyond the 72 hours? And between HHS and ICE and CBP and some of the other folks in play, what are the factors at play in driving that? We have a data analysis audit underway looking specifically at the tracking of children during zero tolerance. We are also looking at ICE's ability to quickly and easily remove criminal aliens. It's a lot of work in the space. I think the first job that will be issued will be the data tracking work. We will follow shortly with most likely the capping report on all these inspections and perhaps some asylum seekers work this fall.
When you say this fall, when do you expect that to be?
You're going to pin me down, aren't you?
Well,
I think we're going
broadly
to.
speaking.
I think the reports will start coming out September and roll out towards the end of the year.
That's great. Well, Mr. Morgan, as we talked about in my office and other occasions, transparency is critically important. So I would certainly hope that we have your commitment to ensure that the OIG retains access to unannounced facility visits and anything else necessary to conduct oversight, which is absolutely critical to maintaining transparency.
Absolutely, sir. And there's an old saying, I think great agencies remain great because they believe they can get better. And I believe with the OIG is one significant step in how we maintain that.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Peters. Before I turn it over to Senator Portman, because you raised the issue of pediatricians, Commissioner Morgan, I've spoken with you about the fact that I've met with both the representatives from the American Academy of Pediatricians as well as nurse practitioners who are offering, I guess, individuals who want to go down and help. And you said you would do everything to facilitate that. Do you want to just make that kind of public commitment?
Yes, sir, absolutely. There are some challenges with that, obviously, but anyone who wants to come and assist us with our continuing expanding medical care, it's absolutely, I would be more than welcome to work with them. And we've done a lot. We're hiring 4 pediatric advisors and a patient safety officer at this time. Just last week, I authorized for CBP to go forth with hiring our own chief medical officer. We've expanded our medical contract now to almost, I think, a little under 300 medical professionals that we're sending out across 7 sectors and 20 of the stations, and we're expanding more every single day.
Well, I don't want to just have people show up at the border, so it's got to be coordinated. So I guess I would just suggest if you'd be willing to meet with those same representatives and you can kind of hash out a coordinated technique or method for those individuals to help out.
Yes, sir, and we have 2 physicians right now, one at DHS that's coordinating the overall Southwest Border Medical Initiatives. We have one that's detailed specifically to CBP. I think it would be a great idea to include the pediatricians into the fold with these physicians and have some meaningful dialogue on how we can get better.
So we'll try and facilitate that. Senator Portman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you both for being here today. This is a tough issue, and what we've been trying to do in this committee is to look at it from an objective point of view and try to get some bipartisan solutions, particularly on the root causes. It's been hard. Honestly, we don't have consensus yet, and that's frustrating because I was down there on July 12th, as I think you know, Commissioner, and had the opportunity to go to the McAllen sector and see what was going on. Went to the Donna processing facility and also the Customs and Border Protection processing facility there, the station, and it's a bad situation. There's obviously a huge influx of individuals, but what's really tough is the influx of families and kids, and that's unprecedented. There's been no previous time in our nation's history we've had this many people coming across the border who are in family units and have to be taken care of differently. One of the things that was interesting at the Donna processing facility, and I think this is something that some of my constituents have found surprising, the families I talked to, and I spoke to 5 or 6 families. My Spanish is good enough to get by, and I asked them, why are they here and how long they plan to be here, and I also talked to the Border Patrol about that, of course, Customs and Border Protection. And the honest answer is they expect it to be released into the United States, and the Customs and Border Protection people expect it to release them within a few days. In fact, for some of them, within a couple days, I was told. And so that's the understanding on both sides. And the reason is that they cannot be processed during the time period that we have, particularly if they have, again, a minor child with them. So, I mean, it's pretty common sense. Unless we fix those laws, change those laws, we're not going to be able to keep people in any kind of a detention facility or a processing facility long enough to be able to assess whether it's appropriate for them to come into the United States legally. And so we are simply releasing them into the community. And the nonprofits are helping to ensure people have what they need when they leave the processing facility and get them on the buses and get them on the airplanes and take them to communities around the country. These people have been processed and they've been told to show up at a court hearing, and some of them do and some of them don't. And typically it takes a couple years, actually between 2 and 3 years for the first hearing, and then typically 5 or 6 years, we were told, before the case is finally resolved. And you can imagine during that time period, a lot of folks tend to stay in the United States and not show up at those hearings. Those numbers are hard to get in terms of how many show up. I don't know if you have anything on that today, either one of you. The numbers I've heard is that fewer than half actually show up for the final hearing to be able to determine their status. Is that still accurate?
That's accurate, sir. That's information that I have.
Jennifer, do you have any? Ms. Costello?
We don't have any information on that. That would be a justice statistic.
So today we're focused on the conditions at the border, but I guess my point is this will continue, and we're not going to be able to resolve it unless we come up with some common sense solutions to a very obvious problem, which is traffickers going to poor families in Central America and saying, if you come, if you're willing to pay us $5,000 to $10,000 and come with us, we can get you into the country. In fact, we don't even have to do anything else other than leave you at the border and you walk across a bridge, or in the case of some of the families I met, across the river, and present yourself, and you can go into America. And when you can make 10 to 20 times more here in America than you can in your home country, it makes sense. You and I would do the same thing probably if we were given the opportunity to help our families. But we have a legal immigration system, and there are people waiting not just for months, but for years in those same countries to come legally. And so I don't think the problem is really that hard to understand. The asylum issue on top of it obviously adds some complexity. In terms of the overcrowding that I saw, and what I saw was overcrowding in the men's facility at the Customs and Border Protection processing facility. And the analogy that the Customs and Border Protection people were telling me, which I think makes sense, is this is more like the police station where you process people, but it's not a detention facility. The detention facility is ICE runs. And Congress, in the $4.6 billion that we sent down to the border, which I think was absolutely necessary, and I'm glad it's there, and it's being used to help with the humanitarian crisis on the border. But Congress said, no, we're not going to fund these ICE beds. So I saw the report from the Inspector General, the OIG finding from your trip to the border. I imagine Ms. Costello and your colleagues, it says, due to shortage of ICE beds, Border Patrol has had to hold detainees longer than 72 hours. That was one of your findings.
Yes, that's accurate.
So it's not that complicated. If we're not willing to fund ICE beds, and under Flores, you can't hold people for more than 20 days, and you can't process people during that time period, it leads to a bad situation. So, you know, is everything perfect in the border? No, it's not. There is overcrowding. Now, I will say, at the Donna facility, which is a soft-sided facility, we did not see the overcrowding. It's a new facility. My understanding is you have a new processing facility for adult males. Is that up and going yet? I know you're talking about putting a new one in place.
It should be in the next 10 days, sir.
In the McAllen
Yes, sir.
district as well. So I think that Congress has got a pretty obvious choice here, which is, one, how to deal with the immediate crisis, provide the ICE beds, provide more judges, expedite these processes as much as you can, take away the ability for traffickers to say, if you just walk in, you get in, otherwise this continues. And then second, we've got to look at the root causes. And that does include our asylum system. I've been promoting this idea, and some Democrats have expressed interest in this, in having people processed in their home country or in a third country. UNHCR, the United Nations, does it all over the world. And they have 4 or 5 processing centers in Central America. They have one in Mexico. They've expressed some interest in working with us on that. That, to me, makes a lot of sense. It's the same criteria as the asylum criteria, the credible fear. And then what the chairman has talked about in terms of expediting the processing, Operation Safe Return. And then finally, more effective aid to these countries, because we have spent a lot of taxpayer dollars in the Northern Triangle. And obviously, the results have not been impressive in terms of the socioeconomic conditions and the great poverty that's down there. There's no question about that. We can do a better job. But we can't address that problem and expect that someone, again, who can make 10 to 20 times more coming to this country is not going to continue to have that incentive if, in fact, we have a system in place that allows them to come into our country. And on the asylum front, of course, people that have a credible fear ought to be taken care of. But when you get to the end of that process we talked about earlier, after the 4 or 5 years, only 15% of those migrants are granted asylum. And that can be determined much earlier in the process, and preferably earlier in the process so they don't have to make the long and arduous and dangerous journey north, which so many traffickers are exploiting so many poor families in Central America to take that journey. Anyway, thank you for your service, both of you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hassan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Peters, for this hearing, and thank you to both of our witnesses for being here today. I also want to take a minute to thank the men and women of the Border Patrol for their hard work, and to thank so many of them who I know work to save lives on the border every day. I also want to note that we can absolutely address the root causes of this crisis, which are multiple, and improve conditions for migrants and secure our border without taking up controversial issues like the Flores decision. Mr. Morgan, 3 weeks ago, I asked CBP's Chief of Law Enforcement Operations Directorate, Brian Hastings, about the conditions at the Clint, Texas Border Patrol facility, following reports by a group of lawyers sent to inspect the facility describing the horrid conditions endured by migrants detained there. Mr. Hastings repeatedly dismissed the reports as not true, and he implied that the lawyers were exaggerating solely to advance the case of their clients. Only 6 days later, Ms. Costello issued a report about facilities in the Rio Grande Valley, depicting some of the same troubling conditions as reported by the group of lawyers that inspected the Clint facility. Mr. Morgan, I have been to the border twice, and I get that the Border Patrol is overwhelmed and that its agents feel like they are under fire. However, our job in Congress is to conduct extensive oversight and to use that oversight as a way to help drive our funding decisions and to uphold our values. When senior officials from the Border Patrol refuse to be transparent or seek to mislead Congress, it does serious damage to the credibility of the entire Border Patrol. It exacerbates agents feeling as if they are under fire. And most importantly, it undermines the security and humanitarian mission that we are all grappling with. It keeps us from addressing the root causes in the way we need to. So to that end, Mr. Morgan, please answer yes or no to the following. Will you commit to giving Congress full visibility into the Border Patrol, its detention practices, its treatment of all migrants, and any credible allegations made by detainees?
Yes.
Do you have the support of your superiors, namely the acting Homeland Security Secretary and the President, to be fully transparent with Congress as you deal with this crisis?
Unquestionably, I do.
Thank you. Will you take appropriate action if any CBP or Border Patrol subordinate seeks to mislead or deceive Congress or the American public?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Morgan, there really are two different crises occurring at our border facilities. The first is the lack of supplies and space driven by the huge surge in migrants. Congress has passed an aid package to address this surge with our own surge of resources. More needs to be done, and it will be. However, the second crisis is much deeper. Allegations of cruel and the illegal treatment of migrants in Border Patrol's custody have plagued the agency in recent weeks. These allegations include the sexual assault of an underage migrant, the attempt to humiliate a migrant by forcing him to wear a sign that says, quote, "I like men," close quote, and intentional deprivation of basic necessities of migrants, including children, as a way to punish them. Mr. Morgan, this troubling pattern of the Border Patrol's culture, and I know it's not everybody in Border Patrol, has to be addressed immediately. What steps are you taking right now to change this culture?
First of all, I think we have to be cautious about when there are allegations that have not been fully adjudicated yet to refer to this as a pattern or part of a culture. I don't believe that, ma'am. I served as chief of the United States Border Patrol, and I would not say what you described is a culture within the Border Patrol or a pattern. But what I will say, and I promise and commit to you, is that any allegation will be thoroughly and completely investigated, and anybody, any man or woman in the United States Border Patrol or CBP that violates their oath and violates what they swore to do and uphold, I assure you that they will be held accountable for and properly disciplined.
Well, I thank you for that. I will note that the revelation about the Facebook page and the number of people participating in that tends to give credence to the notion that there is a troubling culture, at least among some of the officers. And what I'm trying to just get at is what you are doing to make sure that you are disrupting that culture and improving it.
Yes, ma'am. And on the Facebook of the 1015, I would be more than happy to offline come to your office and provide you an extensive brief of exactly what we're doing in that matter as well. But I will say look, one of those posts that we all know about is horrendous.
Yes.
Absolutely,
Right.
hands down. But I can assure you that overall, this is a very small group of Border Patrol agents.
Ms. Costello, do you think CBP is doing enough in terms of addressing the issues of culture that I just outlined?
So we don't really have any information on what they're doing in the culture, but I can tell you that we're also looking into that Facebook issue, not so much the conduct of the specific agents themselves, which is better investigated by CBP's Office of Professional Responsibility. But what we are looking into is the allegations that leadership knew and was using the site for information. So who knew what, when, and was appropriate action taken and when it needed to be. So I think perhaps in the course of that review, some information about culture might be elicited.
Thank you.
And if I could add, ma'am,
Yes.
we are working with the IG, every day. And Facebook, for example, I mean, right away, we got with the IG and we continue to work with them.
Well, I appreciate this. I just do want to point out that it is going to be very important that you all are transparent about what you do and don't know. As you investigate allegations, you have to be transparent with us and the American public so we can improve, because these kinds of reports and these kinds of behaviors that are reported and the conditions are really hampering our capacity to address a security and humanitarian crisis at our border, and that's something we all need to do together.
You have my absolute commitment to full transparency.
Thank you. I have one other issue, and I'm going to touch on it very briefly because I'm just about out of time, but it's come to my attention, Mr. Morgan, that in May, a Customs and Border Protection subcontractor, a company called Perceptics, was a victim of a cybersecurity breach. Hackers stole tens of thousands of photos of travelers' faces and license plates collected by CBP on the U.S.-Mexico border from the subcontractor's network and then leaked these images publicly. This breach has serious implications not only in cyberspace but also for the security of our borders. It's my understanding that this data was not supposed to be present on the subcontractor's network to begin with, and that CBP has since terminated this contract. However, this begs a bigger question about the vulnerability of CBP because its contractors seem to not be taking subcontractors seem not to be taking cybersecurity seriously. So I would, realizing my time is about up or over, what I'd like to do is work with you and follow up with questions about this to ensure that the contractors and subcontractors adhere to the highest cybersecurity standards.
Absolutely.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Both of you, thank you for the work. I just returned back from the border last weekend, spending last weekend at 5 different facilities in the Rio Grande Valley area, and then spent much of the night riding along with members of the Border Patrol as they did night patrols to get a feel for what's really going on the ground. I went into each facility and asked to be able to see their supply room, to see food, water, hygiene products, diapers, clothing, toothbrushes. In every facility that I went into, all of those supplies were there in ample supply. I also found in some of the facilities a couple of pieces of used equipment like car seats, and I asked about that and said, these seem like used car seats, where did they come from? And they said some of the children have to be moved to different places, and so Border Patrol agents have brought their own car seats for their kids here to be able to make sure these kids have car seats when they actually move from facility to facility. What I found was a tremendous number of very professional people trying to be able to find a way to be able to manage a problem where they have thousands upon thousands of people coming at them. In the McAllen station, in that area alone, they have 1,500 to 2,000 people a day that are coming across the border illegally, and they're trying to figure out ways to processing them. And when I asked the agents what would help you the most, the first response I got from everyone was allow ICE to be able to detain people. That's what they do, not what we do. And what I heard as a pretty clear statement was when this whole movement on abolish ICE or defund ICE came about, in the push to not allow ICE to get more funding and the adamant pushback we've had on adding additional funding to ICE, it's backing up thousands of individuals into Customs and Border Patrol facilities to be able to be held while they're waiting for a place for them to go. We've got almost 50,000 beds in ICE facility, but 4,000 beds in Customs and Border Patrol. And when you've got thousands of people a day coming at them with nowhere to go, you're not going to just release them on the street. That's not the obligation of federal law enforcement, just to release people, is to be able to process and find out who's a risk and who's not a risk, and then to figure out how to be able to transition them. So my simple question to you is, are your facilities designed and set up to hold thousands of people? Is that the mission of Customs and Border Patrol?
Absolutely not, Senator.
So
And we've stated that again and again and again.
And I've heard it, and so much of our conversation at this dais and through Congress is what we're going to do to get Customs and Border Patrol in a better position to hold more people, ignoring the obvious question, why aren't we adding additional funding to ICE
That's what they do. They do have the facilities, they do have the contracts, they do have all of the oversight there to be able to allow a lot more people to be held as they're trying to process them. So I'm a little frustrated that our conversation seems to be, what can we do to help Customs and Border Patrol be better at detaining people, when that's not even the mission of Customs and Border Patrol?
Yes, sir, and that's correct. And right now, I mean, just in the past 60 days since the IG review, we've done so much. We've created 4 soft-sided facilities, 4 family units alone, a capacity of over 2,000. 2 more soft-sided facilities are coming on for single adults, a capacity of 4,500. I could keep going. Modular systems we're setting up. I could keep going on and on. This is at taxpayers tens of millions of dollars a month we're spending on this. We're talking about for us to do more and for CBP to get more for these temporary facilities. When you just outlined the answer is we fund ICE. We asked for $200 million in supplement. It was denied. And then we questioned why we are overcrowded. We're overcrowded because ICE does not have the funding to have the bed space as the system is designed. We're interdependent. We're overcrowded in part because HSS was overcrowded, because ICE was overcrowded, and it was not being properly funded, and ICE is still not being properly funded.
No, it's not. And that is part of our challenge, that we've got to be able to break through this. We're spending over $200 million on one soft-sided facility this year instead of giving $200 million to ICE to be able to manage all of those. So it's not only wasteful to the taxpayer, it's not fair to those men and women that are serving Customs and Border Patrol to be able to have do something that they were not first set up and trained to do, to try to do makeshift facilities, rather than actually to have a better facility for folks to be able to go through this process. I had lots of questions there about the Flores settlement, and we've heard even some conversation on this dais that the Flores settlement's not the issue. What I heard when I was at the border was adults that are traveling with a child, when they arrive with a child and there's a 20-day clock that is ticking at that point, are we able to get criminal records from countries outside of the United States, obviously, from other countries within 20 days of who this adult is traveling with this child?
Not efficiently.
So some countries can, some countries cannot. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So do you have situations where you have had to release an adult because of this time period, this Flores agreement time period, where you've released an adult traveling with a child and later discovered that that adult is a felon from that country?
I don't have those statistics, sir.
So I'll tell you what I heard this past weekend from some of the Border Patrol folks that I talked to there on the border. They gave me 2 specific examples that have happened recently, that they released an adult and then found out after they were released an adult with a child, and then found out 2 weeks later that that adult had a murder warrant in their home country, and they just released them into the country, and they could do nothing about it. I also found out that one of the agents was telling me they had released an adult traveling with a child, and then found out after they were released, when they got the criminal records in from home country, that that was a convicted pedophile from that country now traveling with a child somewhere in our country. And because we couldn't detain them for longer than 20 days and we couldn't get those criminal records, they're released in the country and they're traveling with a child. The other thing that I heard that I thought was interesting was it was children that were maybe 7 to 10 years old that were traveling with adult males. But when I got to the facility in McAllen last week, it was almost all infants and very young children. And when I asked about that, they said we were able to pull people out and separate the child from the adult, interview the child, and the child could often tell us, that's not my dad. Now with infants, you can't do that anymore. Have the cartels changed methods?
Absolutely. That's why they're a multi-billion-dollar organization, because they change and they profit from it every single time. Border Patrol alone has identified 5,800 fake families. HSI, a part of investigative element of ICE, has put resources down there. They've discovered hundreds of fake families. The stories are happening every single day. And it's very clear, Senator, is that they know you grab a kid, that's your passport in the United States because of the Flores settlement agreement. That has to be changed, and it's going to take a legislative fix to do that. If that does not happen, all this other stuff we're talking about, the care, which we absolutely have to do, it does nothing, though, to stem the flow. If we don't address the Flores settlement agreement, they're going to keep coming.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thanks, Senator Lang, for an excellent line of questioning. I want a quick follow-up before I turn it over to Senator Rosen. Where are we at in terms of DNA tests? Because when we were down there, There were some pilot tests of that is about $200 per DNA test. Are we doing more of those, or is that on hold?
So ICE is in charge of that program, so they did do a pilot program. It was very successful, and they asked for additional funding in the supplemental, which they were granted, so they're going to begin to expand that program. But right now, I don't know the specific details of where and when. I'd have to defer to ICE.
But because we're really releasing right out of CBP, in many cases bypassing ICE, won't Border Patrol have to do the DNA test to try and get some handle on the fraudulent families?
Right now, what's happening is ICE is actually deploying HSI agents to the southwest border to actually be in the stations to do that.
Okay. Senator Rosen.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Peters, for considering my request to hold a hearing on conditions of migrant children at CBP facilities today, and this critically important topic. It's vital that we work together to ensure the safety and well-being of children. So I want to thank you, Commissioner Morgan, Deputy Inspector General Costello, for your testimony, for your work, and your commitment to doing the right thing here. So I've asked last month for 3 needed reforms. I placed hold on 2 DHS nominees. I'm going to keep my hold in place until the facilities drastically improve. As you know, a couple weeks ago, we went down, we visited Donna, McAllen, and Ursula, saw the conditions of the detention centers holding migrant children. They are slightly better than what was reported weeks prior, and those facilities are still no place for children to stay for prolonged periods of time or really any amount of time. I've been advised by child welfare advocates from various nonprofit organizations that there are 3 immediate changes needed at CBP. 1, more medical professionals with pediatric experience at CBP facilities. 2, the hiring of trauma-informed child welfare professionals to ensure the best interests of the children are being met. And 3, providing NGO access to CBP facilities to assist with humanitarian efforts. Last week, I sent a letter to Secretary McAleenan outlining these needs, and in spite of the urgent situation at the border, I've yet to hear back from him. So I'm asking, in the interest of time, if you would answer these similar questions in yes or no fashion. So, Commissioner Morgan, who currently, well, this is not a yes or no, who currently screens children for illnesses or injury after apprehension by CBP? Is it a medically trained professional?
So we have a couple layers, ma'am, and I know quickly. So we have Border Patrol agents who, when they are first apprehended, do a first layer of screening, whether an EMT or advanced EMT. Once they get to the processing center or the place where they're going to be held, then they're also screened. The majority of the children right now are screened by a medical professional, such as a nurse practitioner.
Are they using standardized screening tools?
Yes, ma'am. The protocols are absolutely actually developed by a physician that we have at DHS that has designed those protocols with respect to medical standards in industry.
So they're taking vital signs such as body temperature, blood pressure, and heart rate?
Yes, ma'am, every single one, and they actually have a range of temperature. They file as part of protocol. If it falls within that range, it means immediately transport to a hospital.
Do all CBP facilities have adequate working medical equipment for children?
No, all do not. We're doing it by flow and threat and need right now, but we are expanding that every single day. 7 of the 9 sectors have it, over 20 of the 70 stations have it, and every day we're putting more medical resources online.
Thank you.
Supplemental help.
If a child is found to be injured or sick, is there a process for them to receive additional evaluation by a healthcare professional?
Yes, we work with local EMS, local medical facilities as well. And again, based on those protocols, if the individual is showing, meeting those standards, we transport them immediately to the hospital.
Do your medical professionals on site at those facilities walk into pods or cells to look for sick individuals who may be too young to voice their needs, unable to ask for help, or are too afraid to ask for medical attention?
So we do welfare checks. Whether each one of those welfare checks, they actually go into the holding facilities, I need some more fidelity on that, but there are welfare checks that are mandated by TEDS every 15 minutes.
And approximately how many more medical professionals with pediatric experience and child welfare professionals do you plan to hire?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say I'm welcome to anyone that you just described that continue to work with us to help us come up with that strategy and end game. We're welcome to any ideas and suggestions, but those numbers are being worked right now, again, from the physician that DHS has as the overall medical coordinator, as well as other, I would say, healthcare provider associations.
I'm going to ask, is there pediatric mental health screening in detention?
Not at this time. And again, I would just say that I understand, but again, I want these children out of those, even the soft-sided facilities. I agree with you, ma'am. That's not where kids should be. I want them out of there as fast as possible to a more adequate environment.
So who's ensuring that very young children have their basic needs met, such as diaper changing, feeding, bathing, or brushing teeth?
So we actually have coordinators in every one of those facilities, and the Border Patrol and other agencies that are helping us are responsible for that. We actually have detailed logs that logs when someone's fed, whether they receive a hot meal, a cold meal, how many times they receive a shower, and et cetera. We have detailed logs on that.
So you've expressed just now interest in working with me to make some things happen. So are you developing a policy to provide access for NGOs to CBP facilities to assist with these humanitarian efforts?
So what I can say is those have been ongoing discussions, and Senator, I'm absolutely willing to work with you to come up with a workable solution.
Because we do have people willing to come in to help alleviate some of this situation and provide comfort care specifically for
Yes,
children.
ma'am. What I can say, the 115, 116 of Congress, we've had over 100 CODELs, staff DELs, almost the same number. We've had countless numbers of IG reports and other access and reviews. So we're not shy away from
But we'd
someone
like to
coming in.
see NGOs have access, better access, to be sure they can evaluate children who oftentimes cannot express concern or express what's happening to them. So I'd like to be sure that we are able to do that and can work with you. I have people ready, willing, and able to come to your facilities.
Yes, ma'am.
I just have a short time left. I want to be sure that Senator Hassan talked about abuse. Can you talk a little bit about the process for migrants to safely report any abuse that they have and if they're aware of that?
Yes, again, from the start, they have the ability from the moment that they're apprehended to report anything. What we have found, though, is once that they leave Border Patrol custody, CBP custody, and they go to HSS specifically for the children, that's when we found that most of the reporting is being done after they leave our custody.
So they don't have, so they're not reporting there, they're reporting after they leave. And
That's what the statistics show, yes, ma'am.
to your knowledge, is there a confidential process there for them to report so they don't receive retaliation wherever they go in the future?
Yes, ma'am. It's hard to have that confidentiality when you're in a central processing center or the soft-sided Donna facility that you saw that's wide open. But we absolutely take every allegation seriously and do everything that we can to make sure that it's followed through, and we coordinate with the appropriate entity, whether it's the IG, CRCL, or any appropriate entity.
Where, do you have a specific place where the logs are kept once the information once abuse is reported? Do you have a central location where that's kept so that NGOs or other places can take a look and see what's going on?
Yes, ma'am. So we have a joint information center. It's called the JIC. So anytime there's a complaint or alleged complaint that goes to the JIC, that OPR from CBP manages, and that database is kept.
So if NGOs want to come in and represent someone, there will be transparency with these records.
So there's some privacy concerns with that with respect to ongoing investigations, but I'd be more than happy to work with you offline to see where we can reach an appropriate compromise for transparency. But there are privacy concerns with respect to investigations.
Thank you.
Senator Sinema.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate our witnesses being here today. I remain extremely concerned about the recent allegations regarding the treatment of migrants at the Yuma Border Patrol Station. I'm committed to fixing our broken immigration system, finding solutions to the ongoing crisis at our southern border, and ensuring that migrants are treated fairly and humanely. The recent reports regarding what happened in Yuma clearly indicate we need to do better on all those fronts. So I look forward to our witnesses shedding light on how CBP can do better and how Congress can help do better. My first questions are for Mr. Morgan. As you know, a big part of the problem at Yuma seems to be communication between HHS and CBP. The news of the Yuma allegation broke because NBC News obtained incident reports put together by HHS case managers after migrant children had left CBP custody. But it's unclear to me if the HHS information flowed into CBP in an efficient manner and in a way that CBP could then take immediate action to ensure the well-being of these children. What steps is CBP taking, or have you already taken, to improve the response and ability to respond in a timely fashion to allegations that come through HHS?
So Senator, you're right. I think there's definitely an area where we can improve the flow. There's an old saying, justice delayed is justice denied. And so I think we can get better at that. Once we saw that article, we actually immediately worked with the IG. There were 3 separate allegations contained in the article. One of them had already been opened and was already being worked by the IG. The other 2, based on the article, we opened up our own investigations. And then we went to HSS OOR to ask them about the alleged 30 that were contained in the article. And what we found is that on a consistent basis, OOR sends those to CRCL, Civil Rights Civil Liberties Division, which is good. That's another layer of oversight it needs to be, because some of the allegations aren't always specific misconduct of employees and may say, hey, our cell was too cold or too hot, which still needs to be looked upon and actioned. And so then we coordinated with CRCL. We found out through this process that 381 entries had been made by ORR with respect to a series of allegations. We actually obtained all 381. OPR triaged those, and because of that, we opened up 23 additional investigations. Now, having said that, the bottom line is what we're trying to do is work with CRCL and HSS OOR, and what we asked them to do, and they've agreed, is as they send it to CRCL, they also send us those significant activity reports directly to CBP OPR, so we can action them right away.
So, Commissioner, then you're getting them in real time as of today?
I can't speak as today, but that is the end state, and we're working with them.
Okay. My second question is, as I understand, the information from HHS, as you said, enters DHS through the CRCL or through the OPR, the Office of Professional Responsibility. But when OPR receives the series of allegations, how do they use that information to prevent additional incidents? So what do they do to take action, one, to protect the alleged victims at the time, and then also to prevent that same behavior from allegedly occurring to other individuals? And what mistakes were made in this overall communications process that you all have learned from that you can fix and change for the future?
So through OPR, we also work with them, and so it's not just about the investigations, but then it's also, once it's been adjudicated and effective discipline has been handed down, we also look at that and analyze that and then take that back to the field to see, hey, are there other areas that we can improve upon? So it's not just about handing down the discipline, as you said, it's about taking corrective actions to get better at what we do to try to prevent any other incident from happening in the future. As far as the coordination and control, again, I think it's, as I explained, it's continue to work with CRCL, it's continue to work with HSS OOR to make sure we have a streamlined system as far as reporting. What we've asked them to do is give that, and that goes directly into our JIC that I talked about a minute ago, and then it gets actioned immediately.
And for children who've alleged sexual abuse, that obviously is quite different than an allegation that a cell is too cold or someone doesn't have a blanket. One, you rectify by changing the temperature and providing a blanket. The other, alleged harm may have already occurred with the resulting trauma that comes from that. What actions are taken to provide appropriate mental health care to children who may have been traumatized by these alleged sexual assaults?
Again, so I would have to refer to HHS OOR, because once the release from our custody and that allegation is made, as far as continued care for that child, it's really outside our purview.
Okay. My next question is from Ms. Costello. According to the news reports, we just mentioned, there were 30 allegations of issues at the Yuma facility that flowed from HHS to DHS. Did your office get to see all of these complaints right when HHS transmitted them to DHS? And from your perspective, how could the information sharing between HHS and DHS, as well as between components of DHS, be improved?
Thanks for the question, Senator. We did get your letter on this matter. I think Mr. Morgan has accurately described this process, and, I mean, your letter and the news reports caused us to go back and take a look as to how this was working, and he's correct. HHS is getting the allegations to the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Office, who is passing them on to CBP, and then because of our right of first refusal, they're coming to us. We're going to start taking a look into that as a result of your letter. I think my staff is scheduling a meeting with your office to see, can that be improved? There was such a large number of allegations here, and I know we knew about some of them. As Mr. Morgan said, we actually opened on one of them. But it does seem to be a more systemic issue, right? That's more appropriate for one of our other offices to start taking a look at as opposed to individual investigations. So we're going to be following up with your staff and to try to get some answers to those questions that you posed in that letter.
Thank you. Back to Mr. Morgan. Strictly from a personnel perspective, what changes need to be made so that CBP can more effectively manage the overcrowding that we are experiencing at some of these facilities? Do we need a different mix of people working at these facilities, more training? Do we need more social workers, more medical personnel? What is it that we need in order to address allegations and prevent them from occurring in the future?
Well, man, two different things. Allegations or the overcrowding. The overcrowding, I'll continue to go back to, we need Congress to pass meaningful legislation to stem the flow, and that will impact the overcrowding. But specifically to the allegations of misconduct, again, I'll go back. I think that these allegations are rare instances, although one is more than enough. And again, we're committed to working with CRCL, IG, to make sure that those cases are investigated thoroughly and the appropriate disciplinary action is taken, and that those individuals, the best of our ability, are removed from those areas right away.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time's expired.
Senator Carper.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. My thanks to you and our ranking member for calling this hearing, and our thanks to both Mr. Morgan and Ms. Costello for your work and your presence. My colleagues to my left have heard me talk about root causes so often that I'm sure they're sick of it, and perhaps some of the folks in the audience are as well. But we're going to be sitting here asking these same questions 5 years from now, 10 years from now, unless we address the root causes for why these hundreds of thousands of people want to get out of their countries and get into our country. We've asked questions of a lot of people in Honduras, Guatemala, and Salvador. Why are you trying to leave your country to make it to the U.S.? And they basically say three things. They say, one, lack of hope, lack of economic opportunity in their native country. Number two, crime and violence. Number three, endemic corruption. And until we help them satisfactorily address those causes, they're going to keep coming. Chairman's heard me say this before. We traveled together in Central America and on the border. And it's a little bit like Home Depot. You know, what they say at Home Depot, you can do it, we can help. We can't do this for them. But we're responsible for, by virtue of our addiction to drugs, we're largely, not entirely, but largely responsible for the conditions that force a lot of people, compel a lot of people to come to our country. So I would just say that as a predicate. A couple of questions, if I could, from Mr. Morgan. Ms. Costello, if you want to correct him, you're welcome to do that. But Mr. Morgan, can asylum seekers currently apply for asylum or refuge protection in the U.S. without leaving their home countries?
No.
All right. Would you support the creation of an in-country processing program to allow asylum seekers to avoid making the dangerous journey to our southern border?
Yes.
Why?
So we talk about, you talk about, sir, the root cause, identifying the root cause of this. We have to stem the flow. Asking someone to either claim asylum, apply for asylum in their home country, or the first country they come to, outside of the country that they're alleging they're fleeing persecution from, will do just that. It will stem the flow. Again, the overwhelming majority of the individuals that come to our border that are claiming fear are found to be unsubstantiated, meaning they came here as an economic migrant, and they did not come here with respect to the technical definition of asylum, persecution, and fear of persecution based on race, ethnicity, and religion. And so it would absolutely, almost overnight, begin to stem the flow.
Ms. Costello, do you approve this message? I know this is not necessarily your area of expertise, but go ahead.
Well, that's what I was going to respond. You know, as the IG, the situations outside this country, the push-pull factors are really beyond our jurisdiction.
I understand.
You know, so
Right.
we can't
I just thought I'd
comment.
give you a shot.
Thank you very much,
Sure.
Senator. But we can't comment also on those policy decisions. But what we can commit to is evaluating the effectiveness of the programs once they've been
That's
established.
good. Thank you. Mr. Morgan, another question for you, if I could. You recently served as the director of ICE, and I just would ask, is it reasonable to think that ICE could detain every undocumented immigrant in this country through their removal proceedings? And are there other programs that, like alternatives to detention, that are less costly and could be expanded for non-criminal immigrants?
So I don't think it's reasonable to say that every single individual that's here illegally in the United States would ICE be able to detain. No, I don't think that's realistic, although I still think they need, enhanced funding to increase their ability to detain a greater population. With respect to other option, innovative ideas, I think we need to continue to talk. I think we need to continue to come to the table to talk about other effective ways besides detention. But I will say is, though, the stats will show that if they're detained, it's more efficient, more effective, the entire process. And the non-detained docket, to include alternative detention, it has not proven to be fruitful. And it's actually quite costly. And at the end result, we're having people that remain in this country illegally.
Mm-hmm. Would you support expanding all alternatives to detention in order to reduce the strain on CBP resources at the border?
Again, sir, I think my response to that is I would be committed to having a discussion with you about, continued alternatives, because we are overwhelmed. ICE doesn't have the appropriate funding. What I would like to be able to have a discussion about is where can we come maybe to a happy medium to increase funding to ICE, to increase the bed space immediately so that we can get some relief at CBP, while at the same time maybe come up and discuss alternatives to detention.
We call that a compromise around here.
It's hard to see that sometimes, sir.
Actually, we reported out a bipartisan compromise 5 years of service transportation bill this morning on a 21-0 vote. And so there's hope in a hopeless world. My colleagues and I have traveled in Central America together, and I look forward to going back down there again. If you look at the flow of folks coming out of those three countries, Guatemala, Honduras, Salvador, a big part of the problem in Guatemala is agricultural related, people who grow coffee in the highlands. And they've had like drought after drought after drought, year after year after year, and they're bailing out of there to try to get out of there so they can make a living. And they see they have some opportunities here. But if you look at what's the outflow from Salvador is not as great as it has been from Guatemala and Honduras. What's happened? One of the things that's happened, this is a lesson for them and for us. They've elected a new president in Salvador. He's, I think, 37 or 38 years old. Bukele's his name. And he was mayor of San Salvador, a city of 2 million people, for a number of years and ran for office. He succeeded a 75-year-old guerrilla leader, former guerrilla leader. And I think the people in that country feel a sense of hope. Meanwhile, in Honduras, Juan Hernandez, the president, about a year or so ago, basically asked his Supreme Court, appointed by him, to declare their constitution unconstitutional so he could run for another term. And he won, allegedly, re-election by a narrow margin. The people there are still outraged, up in arms. And they've had it. And if you go over to Guatemala, Jimmy Morales, the president there, for whom I had high hopes, has turned out to be enormous disappointment with respect to corruption, family corruption, all kinds of things. And he's like, basically, he's going to be done and gone by the end of this year. But the people in that country are just fed up with the corruption that's going on. And we can't be silent about our administration. We in Congress, and when we go there, we have to be we need to speak out. We need to speak truth to power. So, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to traveling perhaps later this year with you and with Senator Peters to go down there and get a fresh look at what's going on. Last thing I'll say, thing is really galling in Guatemala. The former Attorney General there, Thelma Dana, who's highly regarded, she was Attorney General for a number of years. She was death on corruption. And when she wanted to run for president, they basically would not let her in the country. kept her out of the country. She could not run. Just shameful. Thank you.
Well, Senator Carper, I think we're going to be traveling down to Central America in October, so love to have you join us. I think it's interesting, Commissioner Morgan's comments about his meeting with the government officials down there. Same comment we heard in 2015 from both presidents of Honduras and Guatemala is, fix your laws that are attracting our young people. Really, we're losing our future to America, so fix those laws. So that's been a consistent theme. Now, I think at the same time, Central America does like the remittances, but I think they are starting to realize that depopulating their countries is not a real good deal for the long-term future of those nations. So hopefully we'll be on the same page. You talked about compromise. I'm always looking for areas of agreement. It's a lot easier. Senator Peters, do you have a couple questions?
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Morgan, it's my understanding that the CBP is conducting a pilot program to train Border Patrol agents as asylum officers to conduct credible fear interviews. And I'd just like to have a little bit more information on the pilot program. How long is the training for these participating agents?
I'm not sure what the duration is. That's really set by USCIS and their standards.
So we could get that information. I'd like to have that.
Absolutely.
How many of these agents have been deployed to date, and to what locations?
So I don't have those numbers.
You'll get those for me as well?
Absolutely.
You probably don't have the answer to this as well. Once deployed, what percentage of their time is spent conducting interviews?
Again, I don't have that information, but I will get that to you.
Do you know why this pilot was initiated? Was it because of a lack of asylum officers at USCIS, or was it for the goal of reaching different outcomes?
No, my understanding it was a lack of USCIS asylum officers.
If that's the case, would you agree that we should be investing in the hiring and training of additional USCIS asylum officers?
Yes.
If USCIS had additional capacity and these Border Patrol agents no longer needed to conduct these credible fear interviews, would the agents in the pilot program be able to return back to line and patrol duties?
I would like that very much.
That would be your intent if that happened?
Yes, sir.
Is the officer, you may not know this as well, but is the officer wearing a uniform and carrying a gun when they conduct these interviews?
They would be wearing a uniform, carrying a gun.
They would be. They'd be in traditional or their regular uniform.
Yes, sir.
Do you know if the CBP is seeking to expand this program and train additional officers to conduct credible fear interviews?
My understanding is we are, but I will get back to confirm that for you.
So in addition to that, we need to know how many officers that you're expecting. I don't believe you wouldn't know that at this point either. So
Absolutely.
So we need to have more detailed information on this, and I appreciate working with you and your staff on that.
Yes, sir.
What has been striking to me in the discussion about detention standards is that there seems to be a great deal of variability in the experience that lawmakers have when they go to the border. We hear different stories from different lawmakers, administration officials, lawyers, advocates, and perhaps all of these experiences could be true because the situation on the ground obviously changes on a daily basis, and conditions can deteriorate very rapidly. So, Ms. Costello, my question to you is, what is your take on the variability across sectors and even detention locations within a sector? And what type of challenges does this pose for you as the OIG in identifying recommendations for an enterprise improvement program across the entire enterprise?
So the experience of our inspectors has been that it changes rapidly, and I can give you an example, although we have not publicly reported yet on our observations in Clint. We actually went there in April, and we didn't see some of the things that were reported on later on. Not saying that they didn't happen, it's just I think that's a good illustration of how quickly things can change. Another example from our reporting is what I testified to earlier, that on one day we had a facility with 125 maximum capacity at 750. The next day it was up to 900. So I think that's absolutely accurate, that you can go down and visit a facility and have a very different experience the next day. In terms of pinpointing root causes, that is going to make it difficult, and it's part of the reason why this effort has led us to look not at the push-pull factors outside the country, but led us to initiate work that's going to look at those drivers behind the 72 hours and why we're not meeting that standard currently.
So, Mr. Morgan, given this is a rapidly changing environment, Could you describe how CBP retains visibility into facility standards and standards of care across these sectors, given the rapid changes that we can sometimes see?
Yes, sir. So TEDS is our guiding factor, just as it was for the OIG during their review. So every single facility uses that standard that was developed in 2015 for the care, feeding, with respect to anyone in our custody.
Ms. Costello, the Council of Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency, CIGI, plans an often overlooked role in facilitating the collaboration between multiple IAGs. And we've heard in testimony today, this has got to be a whole of government approach across a variety of agencies and IAGs. Has CIGI made any changes to how the OIG community coordinates various oversight of border security efforts in particular that you're aware of?
Not SIGI in particular, but we have a very solid relationship with HHS OIG, with GAO, and with Justice. And as we've been doing our work on the border starting last summer, we've been in close contact with them. Now, we can't share specific findings if they haven't alerted their own departments yet and reported to you. But in terms of how we're doing our work, exploring opportunities for joint efforts and the like.
Is there more you can do and help that you might need from this committee to do it?
Let me think about that, Senator, and we'll get back to you. I mean, I think right now we have a positive relationship with the other IGs, and everybody's really committed to working together in space. But we can take that back to the office and think about if there's any other avenues that we could pursue and any help you could provide.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks to both of you for your testimony today.
Thanks, Senator Peters. By the way, if you have to go vote, I'm happy to close out the meeting, or the hearing. I've really got two lines of question here before we close out the hearing. One, I kind of want to go back to a line that Senator Langford was talking about, the problems of releasing people that come across the border illegally rapidly into our country without really knowing who they are. It's just a reality. I mean, our laws prevent us from holding people more than 20 days, and because we can't get the information, we're probably releasing them even sooner than that in many cases, correct?
That's absolutely correct. With respect to family units, since March of this year, United States Border Patrol has been releasing family units directly. So in some cases, they're being released in under 48 hours into the interior United States.
Because it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to try and find the facilities to hold them for 20 days with this overwhelming flow. So instead of Border Patrol turning them over to ICE, a more thorough vetting process, and then ICE releasing them, Border Patrol is doing it directly.
That's correct.
I mean, that represents a real danger to not only potentially our country, but to those individuals.
Especially with the amount of fake families that we are uncovering every single day.
I mean, it is true that we really don't have time to determine, is that the father or is that the human trafficker? Is that his daughter or is that his trafficking victim?
It's a challenge.
So our broken laws are creating risks for these migrants. And so we do focus on that time in custody. And again, nobody would say these are really pleasant surroundings. This is exactly where you'd want to spend the night. Nobody would want to spend the night in those conditions. But the reason we hold people in custody is we do need to take some kind of precaution in terms of where they're released. But even with the precautions we're trying to take, it's overwhelming the system, and people are put in danger, correct?
Not only are they put in danger, sir, but again, that is one of the largest pull factors, and it's not going to stop. We've been talking a lot of stuff. Should we improve on our care and quality of that? Absolutely. But we're still not addressing that. That's addressing the symptoms. That's not addressing the actual disease. And we need to stem the flow. And as long as our laws are where they are, you're going to grab a kid, that is your passport in the United States. They know that in the Northern Triangle countries, and they're exploiting that every single day.
So let's talk about, in my mind, there's really three categories of people coming to this country illegally and being apprehended, or port of entry claiming asylum. You have single adult males, which used to be the problem, the vast majority. Then you have people coming as a family unit, generally one adult, one child, and then you have unaccompanied children. Let's start with the unaccompanied children. My information shows me of the 780,000 people that have come in illegally at the ports of entry, about 67,000 are unaccompanied children this year.
That's correct. The number's a little bit higher.
In the past, the composition of those unaccompanied children would be 70% are male, 70% are 15 or older. Is that composition holding largely true of the unaccompanied children?
Yes, and the majority of them are of between 14 and 17.
So again, if they're more than 15, if they're male, certainly that'd be the profile of an individual that might already be a member of a gang from Central America, correct?
That's correct.
Or if you come to this country, you can't speak the language, you probably gravitate toward those areas, those pockets of other immigrants that speak your language that would be gravitating toward gang activity, correct?
Your vulnerability to be recruited by a gang is exponentially higher under those circumstances.
I am reading reports of the issues that schools are having to cope with. It's not just bilingual education. Now it's not only bilingual, but different dialects from some of the mountain regions of Guatemala. Is that a problem?
Yes.
In terms of the family units, the children coming in, and again, you talked about 300,000 children. So you've got 67,000 as unaccompanied children. Then you've got over 200,000 as part of a family unit. Those would be children more of tender age, right? Which would be defined as, what, 12 and under or 14 or under?
It's changing on a regular basis, but we do find them to be a little bit younger, but I'll have to follow up on the stats.
I asked a question earlier about DNA testing. The few pilots or the few tests we've had show what percentage of people coming in that we determine are fraudulent family. Do you have any sense for that right now?
Don't have the overall percentage, but we do have the numbers. Right now, Border Patrol, 5,800, and HSI, part of ICE, they've identified hundreds since their pilot program of pushing agents forward.
When I was down with Senator Peters and Senator Hassan, I saw about a 40, 50-year-old man with about an 18-month-old girl. And listen, I know children can be fussy. Having just talked about the fraudulent families, I mean, I have to admit, I just looked at that situation right there, and that is not his daughter. And then we heard testimony from HSI, a child being sold for $84 to be used by an adult to get in this country and exploit our laws.
That's correct.
I mean, those are just realities that are occurring here. When we talk about how do we improve the situation, one of the questions you have to ask, what do you design the facilities to hold? What number do you use? Do we use 1.1 million people coming in here annually? Do we go back a couple of years and have it be a couple 100,000? You know, Ms. Costello, what would your advice be on that? I mean, do we just assume that this is going to hold at 1.1 million people per year or potentially grow?
I don't think you can assume that. You know, even just looking at the past statistics over the past years, it fluctuates, and we are experiencing a rise in families this year based on the department's statistics. So, you know, without being able to really concretely weigh in on that, I would say that relying on any one of these numbers is probably not a sound idea.
Commissioner Morgan, what numbers are you using as you're looking forward? I mean, you're obviously putting up temporary facilities. That Donna facility, by the way, those are for temporary facilities, very nice facilities. I mean, that gives people, I think, a fair amount of comfort that Border Patrol is really actively working to improve conditions, but that's not cheap.
No, we are spending tens of millions of dollars. We're probably on target to spend around $700 million, which a lot of that came from the supplement on those soft-sided facilities. And sir, if I could, Senator Peters, he asked me a question about whether the pilot program for Border Patrol agents, whether they were uniformed or not when they were doing the credible fear, and I misspoke. My staff actually told me that they are actually not uniformed and they do not carry a gun.
Okay, I'll actually inform Senator Peters of
Thank
that.
you.
Again, just going back to my question in terms of how are you designing the system? Are you assuming the 1.1 million flow? Do you think that's a smart thing to do? Or do we just design a system where it really can be flexible, that if the flow is reduced, we can adjust?
So that's a tough question because, again, CBP, sir, as you well know, has so many interdependencies, both on HSS for the unaccompanied minors and then ICE for all the other demographics. And it really does depend on how we come together to address this problem. If we're not going to have meaningful legislative fixes and we're not going to fund ICE for beds, well, then I have a different solution. But if you're going to tell me that Congress is going to fund more bed space for ICE to include family residential centers, now we have a different proposal. That's the conundrum we're in right now. We say we're a police station, and we say we're not a long-term holding facility, but we're somewhere in the middle. We're in interim custody. We're not short-term and long-term, but a lot of it depends on what Congress is going to do.
So alternate to detention sounds good, but isn't it true that an ankle bracelet on somebody who doesn't really have a permanent address, that we don't know where they really came from, we don't know where they're really going, those are easily cut off, and that's basically what people do?
That's exactly right. And again, I don't want to speak for another agency, although I was there for a short period of time, but the statistics show that the alternatives detention, it's not productive, and it actually costs exponentially more per removal on the non-detained docket on alternative detentions to detention than it does to detain them. So financially, it's also a challenge.
Well, that's not, I would call that counterintuitive, but there's a reality. You talked about funding. As a fiscal conservative, I was a leading proponent early on of providing government agencies with the funding they need to take care of the situation. On a telephone town hall last week, I realized that wasn't a real popular position. And again, very legitimate concerns on people on the call saying, well, that's $4.6 billion to close out the fiscal year. How better could we spend that money? I mean, people need to understand the cost of apprehending, processing, and dispersing this overwhelming, out-of-control flow of illegal immigrants.
Yes, sir, and I think the American people need to understand $3.5 billion of that supplemental funding went to HHS for children, 300,000 this year. So what the supplemental did, and people need to understand, is it did not address the crisis at all. It did not stem the flow at all. What it did is it just improved our ability to more equitably and efficiently bring these kids into the interior of the United States.
And again, that's
in a humane way.
That's a supplemental emergency spending. Doesn't cover the full fiscal year. It's not going to cover the cost for 2020. It just filled in the gap to address the situation. So let's just very quickly, before I have to go vote, talk about really what the solution needs to be. First of all, what is the first goal of our policy? I mean, I would argue it's to reduce that flow. Would you both agree with that?
Absolutely.
When I was down the border, I talked to Border Patrol and asked them what's the solution, and you get a pretty consistent answers. We have to remove people that don't have a valid claim, and to be a consequence, to be a deterrent, so that others won't indebt themselves to human traffickers, won't mortgage their home, won't pay a year's worth of salary to these, let's face it, evil people.
That's right.
Okay, evil people. We talk about the Feinstein Amendment to the TVPRA, which creates a disparity in how we handle unaccompanied children. We can't voluntarily return them in a safe situation because we just can't do that. We also talk about the Flores reinterpretation, where the Flores settlement really applied to an unaccompanied child. I think her name was it Jenny Flores? Back in 1985. Took a long time to come up with a settlement how we handle unaccompanied children. And then in 2015, because of a lawsuit, because of the Obama administration, you were probably there, decided to detain children with their families. And a court said, no, the Flores standards apply to accompanied children as well. And if you take a look at our chart, it's not up there now, that's really the moment where this was really sparked. And once people realize if you came into America with a family unit, you're going to get to stay. Even though deferred action on child admissions doesn't apply to any people in the future, that was used by coyotes to say, we've changed our laws, come on in as an unaccompanied child or as a member of a family unit, you get to stay. And that's been the reality. I would argue the thing that we really have to address is that gap between, in terms of our asylum laws, of credible fear standard, which lets people in the front door, takes them into this adjudication process where, I hear different numbers, but at least 800,000 backlog cases in immigration courts, correct? 800,000?
Correct.
I was told that we adjudicated last year, a little more than 30,000 immigration cases of people coming in as family units from Central America, about 30,000. About 3,000 were granted asylum. The others were denied. So it's about a 10% rate. There's a real problem when we let all these people in and only, and again, nobody really knows the number here. We really don't know, but somewhere in the 10, probably no more than 20% actually had a valid asylum claim. So I would argue the law change, and it's going to require Congress to act, the law change has to close that gap, has to be to close that gap. And would you both agree with that?
100%, Senator. You hit all three major elements that Congress must do to fix this crisis and stem the flow. It's the credible fear, as you just described. It's TVPRA, where we treat kids different from Mexico and Canada than other countries, and the Florida Settlement Agreement, which says we have to release unaccompanied minors and children within 20 days. Those are the three fixes.
It's also true that we're releasing, I think, 79% of unaccompanied children to a person in the U.S. that's undocumented. Correct?
I don't know the specific stat, but that is happening every single day.
We are only able to remove 7% of people that we don't detain. So we just don't know where they are. Correct?
Sir, that is why another reason why we want to detain is on the non-detained docket. It is extremely difficult once these individuals have a final order removal to go and apprehend them.
So again, the solution is we have to look at that credibility fear standard. We've got to raise the bar on that initial hurdle. We need to squeeze all the inefficiencies out of that initial adjudication process so that we can, again, more rapidly, but I would argue more accurately and fairly, because we don't want to deny asylum to people who really qualify.
Sir, I would even say that by streamlining this process as you just described, that's exactly what we'll do, is that we'll actually be able to more efficiently actually find those that have actual valid asylum claims and take care of them appropriately. Right now, they're getting lost in the system with all the false and fraudulent claims.
So that's the goal of this first step, Operation Safe Return. Again, I don't know what's going to happen with the safe third country, with Guatemala. I think they have to approve that through their legislator. Who knows what kind of court challenges both here and in Guatemala may occur. Operation Safe Return uses existing authorities. You know, we've spoken with you, the other component heads within DHS, to implement that program, to start it, again, to rapidly, more accurately determine those individuals that clearly don't have a legal claim to stay and safely return. You know, from my standpoint, that's what we're going to continue to work on. We have bipartisan support for that initiative, so may I just ask you to do everything you can to work with us on that. Implement it, take a look at, is it working? Are we able to remove those individuals, to be a deterrent, to reduce that flow? Assess how it's working, make adjustments, and move forward. And hopefully at some point in time, we can get the bipartisan support to change our laws to actually fix this once and for all. So anyway, I want to thank both of you for your service. I want to thank the men and women of DHS and Border Patrol and ICE, all these individuals trying to cope with this out-of-control situation. I view them personally as heroes. And I hope they stay on the job. I hope they continue doing a good job. And I truly am grateful. I think this committee is as well. I think you heard that voiced by most members. So if you can convey that back to your component, I'd appreciate that.
I will. They absolutely are heroes, and I thank you for that, and I'll make sure that they know that, Senator.
And again, I'm glad in your testimony you pointed out some of the heroic actions. We've heard other similar situations as well. So the hearing record will remain open for 15 days until August 14th, 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is adjourned.